And I'm going to say welcome to everyone to our second webinar for our ULS Fall Convocation in partnership with Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Services, LIRS. I'm really thankful to have with us today the Director for Outreach, Kristen Whitty. She she's turned into a really great partner, and I look forward to more work with LIRS. It's been a joy to work with Kristen. It was also a real joy to work with Sharon Baglios and Sue Ellen Spots. And I'm thankful that the two of them are participating today, and I'm just happy for this partnership because this is all important work, and this is work that we're all in together. I'm also really thankful to have with us Reverend Ed Whetstone, who is a longtime supporter and worker in immigration and refugee services, with a lot of experience and a lot of history. And so I'm really thankful he's taken the time to be with us today. So the two of them, along with Basel from LIRS, are going to join us for our Q&A session at the end of this time. So just some quick little things about our webinar. So I want to remind you that in our webinar, I've taken away the chat feature because it can be distracting in some ways, and we've been using it in our classrooms for an opportunity to be in discussion during the classrooms. But I find it helpful to be more engaged with the speakers and asking questions. And so that's why we've turned off the chat feature. The Q&A section is available, but if you do have a question, I would ask that you post it there, and I will then be moderating the questions after our presentation times. I am recording this so that if for some reason you have to pop out, or you lose internet, or you have to take a brief break and you miss something important, this will be available for future viewing, and you will receive an email with the links for all of our fall convocation events so that you have an opportunity to review them or share them with others as you're going back into your work. And we encourage you to do that. Share these videos and be in conversation in your context with your people. All right, I am going to start us off with a welcome from our presidents from ULS and LIRS.
I work as a bishop in Southern California. I had many opportunities to connect to migrants and immigrants, and to understand something about the challenges that people on both sides of our southern border face. My time in Central America focused on El Salvador, where we had a partner relationship with the local Lutheran church. We understood ourselves as being a welcoming community within my synod. We were open to migrants, both documented and undocumented, as they appeared and came to us. It was not unusual for an El Salvadoran Lutheran to appear in Los Angeles and come to the synod office for an introduction to one of our congregations. They knew, because of our historic friendship, that they had friends on the American side of the border already, and that we would find them a community in which they could be a part, could belong and thrive and be helped by others who had gone before them. This kind of informal support for immigration is something I think has been characteristic of Lutherans through the year. As I said, in the more distant past, we were welcoming people like ourselves, people who spoke the same language, were of the same race and of Lutheran background. But now, our global Lutheran connections bring us in close contact with people from other parts of the world, and especially in the southwestern United States, with Mexico and Central America. It was a great gift to be able to welcome those people to our synod. They became members of our congregations and are still an important part of our ministry. Our community continued to be enriched by their presence among us. I was proud to live in a place that was increasingly non-white and also made up of people whose first language wasn't English. And even our synod, although it was more white than the community around us, was also of unusual diversity. We continue to be enriched by migration as a church. And I think it's important for us to recognize that we are not simply called to serve those who were born into our community or to evangelize our neighbors, but to welcome those whom God sends to us, often in complicated and dangerous ways, and puts in our midst. The stories of many of the migrants I met in Los Angeles were often terrifying. The stories of danger and violence and separation of families. People would go ahead of the rest of their family in order to find whether they would be safe. They could not travel as a group, so they'd go individually. Sometimes some would make it and others would not. There are stories of great human pain, but it was a blessing to be able to support them and to make them part of our community. They blessed us by their presence. They needed our help, but in the end, we were enriched more by their presence than they were by us. Americans continue to face these challenges even in a time of reduced legal immigration. We have some hope that things will change, but we know that there is no law, there is no wall, there is no force that can keep the North American continent divided into two completely separate zones. We are intertwined, our fates are interlocked, and we will continue to be a continental community, even across the border of the United States. This is a reality. It can't be argued away by politicians or wished away by those who would like to preserve an idea of a white English-speaking United States. We have to deal with the reality as it is. And as Christians, we recognize all of those people in need as brothers and sisters of our own under God. So as we continue this conversation, I'm going to ask Chris to share also some of her own story, but also to tell the stories of those who have faced the danger and the challenge of migration to the United States. Take it away.
Thank you, Dr. Owen. So last week I spoke to this community about the challenges refugees and immigrants face today, and my confidence in the Lutheran Legacy of Welcome. Today, I'd like to tell you a little bit about me and my own history and share how the kindness of strangers transformed my life. I am a proud immigrant. My parents left Sri Lanka as it was entering civil war, a country once known as the Pearl of the Indian Ocean. My parents, like many minority Tamils, were desperate to protect our family. So when my mother's oldest brother left Sri Lanka for America, the hope was that he would help the rest of the family flee. My uncle submitted an application for my mother, but time passed and more time passed and we heard nothing. As my parents' desperation grew, they sought refuge wherever they could find it. And Nigeria was actually the only country that would take us. So we had packed our bags and plane tickets in hand when miraculously, and it truly felt like a miracle, our U.S. application was approved. My parents brought me to this country when I was just 9 months. They came with no jobs, just $200 in their pockets, and 2 very young kids in their arms. We arrived as strangers on foreign soil and were welcomed by the community in our new hometown of Baltimore. It was that personal experience that gave the meaning of Matthew 25 a personal meaning for me. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. Neighbors treated us as friends and eventually family. The superintendent of the Baltimore City Public Schools, where my dad got a job, found us our basement apartment. The vice principal of my dad's school helped us move in and vouched for my parents so they could open a bank account. And it was that warm welcome that gave my parents the opportunity to plant roots, to become educators, and opened a path for me to stand here before you today. I went from that basement to Yale, to Oxford, and eventually to the White House as policy director for First Lady Michelle Obama. And today, I stand before you as the only female CEO of a refugee resettlement agency. I have a beautiful, and I guess I'm a little biased, 3-year-old daughter named Alana, and I know her life will be easier because my own parents' lives were hard. To me, that is the American dream. And that was what called me to this work. When I was first approached by Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service, I'll be honest, I was a little uncertain. I didn't know much about the organization. But the more I learned about the organization and more about the passionate, service-minded people that I spoke with, the more I was inspired. And I became excited about LIRS's incredible legacy of welcome. The hospitality that LIRS has extended to refugees and immigrants for 80 years is the same life-changing welcome that gave me the life I have today. It feels almost as if I'm paying it forward. And in the time I've been with LIRS, it's been so thrilling to watch our organization expand and grow and find new ways to live out our biblical mandate to welcome the stranger. Through refugee resettlement, family reunification, service to our brothers and sisters at the border, advocacy on the Hill, and through opportunities like this convocation to spread our message and mission. I really thank you from the bottom of my heart for the opportunity to share my story, for your support, and most importantly, for your boundless leadership by example. Thank you.
Thank you to our presidents for taking the time to record. And we did have to record because getting 2 presidents in the room on an ongoing basis at the same time is problematic. And so I'm really thankful for the opportunity to have spent some time with both of them and hearing their stories and hearing their joy and their passion around this work. The next thing that we're going to do is move into a video presentation by Reverend Ed Whetstone. And we're doing a video presentation because we weren't sure how well Pastor Whetstone's internet would be in presenting during this time. And so to make things run smoothly, we've decided to do a recording of that. And so I'm going to share that video, and then after that video, we will move into our Q&A time.
A plane was on its way to Minnesota. It carried a nervous family of 6 from Uganda. The mother had been reluctant to come to the United States because she had heard rumors and feared for her 3 sons of military age. The oldest son had secured visas for the family at the American Embassy in Kampala. As the plane landed in Minneapolis on a cold winter morning, the mother looked apprehensively out at the snow-covered airport, and to her horror, she saw a group of people carrying placards moving toward the plane. "You see," she said to her son, "they've come to pick at us already." With trepidation, the family deplaned and were suddenly greeted with a loud cheer. The crowds were members and friends of their sponsoring congregations. They raised placards which spelled out the refugee families' surnames, and underneath, in large letters, was the word, "Welcome." Just one of many thousands of wonderful stories of the Lutheran Legacy of Welcome. Now, I'm by no means an expert on this, but I have read this fine, wonderful book, Open Doors by Richard Solberg, the story of Lutherans resettling refugees, which is very helpful in giving an overview of the topic. And refugees have been a visible and viable presence and thread through all the years of my life. Until 1920, there were no legal restrictions in the United States on immigration. Most of our ancestors just stepped ashore or walked in, which didn't always mean they were well received, of course. Between 1820, when the US Census began to keep more detailed records, and 1920, 33 million immigrants and refugees came to the United States. After World War I, Congress imposed quotas limiting the number of immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe and all of Asia. And during the interim between the two wars, the United States held tight the restrictions on immigration, even as many people in Europe were already in motion, already dispossessed of their homes and their citizenship, already fearful for their lives and their future. Mindful of all this movement, the World Lutheran Convention spawned Lutheran Refugee Service, and in 1938, the National Lutheran Council in North America sponsored Lutheran World Action, which engaged in refugee services. Eventually, through many rearrangements of nomenclatures and Lutheran church bodies involved in adjusting scopes of mission, we would come to our present day Lutheran Immigration Refugee Service and Lutheran World Relief. And I make no pretense of being able to keep straight the shifting of all of those initials, and will make no attempt to do that in my presentation here. This ministry began, we must say, as a ministry to Lutherans, but that was then a great need, and was probably all they could handle. Special attention Solberg gives, and you might be interested to know, was given to pastors and to seminarians. There were appeals to congregations for sponsors, connections. Hundreds came out of that European chaos. And then with the declarations of war against Japan and Germany, our borders slammed shut. After the vast horror and devastation of World War II, there were in Europe 7 to 11 million refugees and displaced persons. You understand, refugees are those who are forced from their country. Displaced persons are those who are forced from their homes, but find some haven elsewhere in their country. Language we still use. And imagine this. 1 of every 3 refugees and displaced persons in Europe was a Lutheran. Incredibly, 1 out of 10 European Lutherans was a refugee. In 1947, the Lutheran World Federation was founded, and they established a refugee department, which had a US office. In 1948, the first displaced persons were received coming from Germany and from the Baltic states. Congress was resistant to the admission of refugees, and it was not popular with the general public, who felt little kindness or compassion for their recent enemy. But of course, many Lutherans were just a single or several generations from their ancestral German homeland. In my preschool years at the parsonage in Harrisburg, I remember guests for dinner who spoke with thick accents, and of guest pastors who came to speak to the congregation. it was evidence, I realize now, of my father's early involvement with refugees. In the 1950s, the refugee flow was increasing rather than waning. They came from Germany, from Austria, from the countries of Eastern Europe, and the church began to recognize that ministry to refugees was not a temporary effort, but an ongoing mission. 1956 brought the Hungarian Revolution. Those valiant freedom fighters who failed when the Soviets brutally crushed Budapest, and the rest of the world quietly watched. But nations did, however, receive the many thousands of refugees. The sympathies of the US public and Congress were roused, and over 21,000 came to the United States. I was 11 that year, and that long winter, when Dad, who was now assistant to the president of Central Penn Synod, spent that long winter at Camp Kilmer, New Jersey, processing Hungarian refugees. He'd get home every couple weeks. Now, I remember giving him a handful of change and telling him to give it to a little boy like me. He wrote that he'd done so and sent this picture of the little boy and his mom. It was only years later that I realized she was forced out of her home when the communists set it on fire, a fire which killed 2 of her children. Only this boy left. Appeals were made to Lutheran churches to sponsor families, and when we moved to St. John, Hagerstown, Dad called in 1958, St. John Sexton and his family were Hungarian refugees. The father had been in the military. He stood erect and showed my father great deference. But mostly, we were intrigued that when he would greet my mother, he would click his heels, take her hand, and bow. One summer, in those years during college, I worked for a stonemason in the congregation. He and his wife had come to the United States as German refugees. It was 1966, and at Gettysburg, I had helped to found the committee opposing the war in Vietnam. So war was much on my mind. We talked about it occasionally. He told me that he'd been in the Hitlerjugend, the Hitler Youth, and as an adult had been an officer under Kesselring. And when he would try to explain how he and so many others had been swept up in the Nazi patriotic and military fervor, he would end just shaking his head, saying, "No one here understands. No one understands." In the 1950s, Lutheran Refugee Services began to consider their calling more than a ministry to refugees and sought to include immigration in their scope of mission. In 1958, a new board was found by the National Lutheran Council, and there were representatives from the Missouri Synod, from the ULCA, and other Lutheran bodies. And the board chose as their chairman my father, George Whetstone. With great vision and hope, the United Nations, whose General Secretary was the great Swedish statesman Dag Hammarskjöld, they declared the year 1959-60 to be the World Refugee Year. And across the world, there were proclamations and stamps from many countries There rose in the U.S. a swell of objections against the immorality of our long-standing refugee quota system. Paul Lemke, long the executive chair of the National Lutheran Council, proposed these 5 objectives for immigration law. Listen to these. They would still be very valid today. Number 1, first objective is to supply our permanent population with a steady proportion of newcomers who have come to the United States as their new homeland and who can impart to their American neighbors an understanding of the cultures, attitudes, and interests of other races and peoples of the world. Number 2, to assume the United States' proper share of international responsibilities for resettlement of refugees and other persons urgently in need of the compassionate haven of a new homeland. Number 3, to facilitate the uniting of families. 4, to facilitate the entry of persons possessing special skills or other capacities needed by the American economy and culture. And 5, to admit annually a reasonable number of the persons described above on an objective basis of selection which, while discriminating, will not be discriminatory with respect to race, national origin, color, or religion, testifying thereby to the United States' recognition of the interlocking and mutual interests of all nations with regard to the migration of peoples, the interaction of cultures, and respect of universal human rights. Always the only work that is possible is that which is permitted by government regulations, as it is still. Always, the Lutheran Refugee Service and its successors, along with other church bodies, have been key advocates in pressing for humane practices and policies. Sadly, so often Solberg describes Congress and the U.S. public as resistant to immigration. It was President Johnson who proposed and signed legislation to end the prejudiced quota system. It proposed an annual cap of 390,000, 120,000 from the Western Hemisphere, Eastern Hemisphere 170,000, the rest of the world, with no more than 20,000 from any one country. Preference was to be given regard to family relationships, skills needed, and refugees from communist countries. On signing, LBJ said, "This repairs a deep and painful flaw in the fabric of American justice. It corrects a cruel and enduring wrong in the conduct of the American nation. It will make us truer to ourselves as a country and as a people. It will strengthen us in 100 unseen ways." Through the 60s, and congregations sponsored Lutherans from Cuba, from Hong Kong. In 1972, Uganda's dictator Idi Amin expelled all those of Indian ancestry, about 75,000, with their participation in the U.S. resettlement effort. And this was new. LRAS began now to work with refugees from countries without a significant Lutheran or even Christian population. In 1975, in the wake of our tragic war, a new surge of refugees came from the countries of Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. LRS was in the thick of it, and appeals were made for congregation sponsors. In 1975 alone, LIRS arranged sponsorship for 2,100 families. The first wave was composed of those closely allied with America, those in the military, and people well educated. Later came the boat people. In 1976, several congregations in Washington County, Maryland, together sponsored the Tran family, a family of 5, St. Mark Hagerstown, Zion Williamsport, and the 3 small congregations of the Sharpsburg parish, my first call. And here they are at the parsonage. A discerning eye may detect my son on the couch. When I was called to Salem in Catonsville on the west side of Baltimore in 1977, I was delighted that they had the year before adopted a family of 9 from Vietnam, the Lay family. One of the sweet stories they told me when I came was that a couple months after arrival, they needed to take one of the children to the hospital. And at the admissions desk, the receptionist asked about their religious preference and said, "Buddhist?" And the mother answered firmly, "We are Lutheran." One of our members leaned over to the pastor and said, "I think it's time we talk to them about baptism." And they were. And as long as the parents lived and the children were in this area, the lays were very active members of this congregation. Some congregations accomplished wonders. Grace Lutheran in Winter Park, Florida, resettled 220 refugees. Trinity in Minneapolis resettled 205. Among the Vietnamese were the Hmong, people who had been staunch U.S. allies, most all settled in Minnesota and California. My home congregation in St. Paul sponsored a large family from Cambodia. A few years ago, when my grandson was in the hospital in St. Paul, I noticed all the signs were in English and in Hmong. You may have seen the movie Gran Torino set in Detroit. If not, you should. Clint Eastwood at one point asks the teenage girl next door how all these Hmong people got there anyway. She says, "Blame it on the Lutherans." It was during this period that LRS also began to work with unaccompanied minors and with undocumented aliens from Mexico and El Salvador. In 1980, our congregation again sponsored a refugee family of the Vuongs from Saigon, a family of 5. I'd taken some of the teens from the Lay family with me to meet them at the airport, and when we greeted them, I could tell something was off. And was from then on the whole visit. And after we left them at their apartment, I asked the girls, and wide-eyed in the back seat, I said, what was going on back there? And they said, "They're Chinese." Historic, ethnic tensions are everywhere. The family was Catholic. They wanted to join Salem. In 1984, we sponsored a Vietnamese brother and sister, young adults. Soon they moved to California to be near relatives, what the book refers to as the second migration. But while they were here, gratefully and artfully, they left us with some of the finest banners we still have. In the following years, LIRS resettled refugees from Chile, Laos, South Sudan, the Balkan states, Kurds from the Middle East. In 1999, Salem sponsored a family of 6 from Kosovo. They were ethnic Albanians, non-practicing Muslims. And we discovered some things were very different than our work with the Vietnamese. Early on, we had a bus full of people take them to DC to show off the Capitol and the sites there. They still live in Catonsville, and we're good friends. In 2004, we sponsored a family of 6, very soon to be 7, who came from South Sudan. This family was Catholic on arrival, and they became faithful members of the congregation. And those in town still are. As they were illiterate, even in their own language, we experienced some special challenges, greater challenges in our work with them. I retired in 2010, and I knew at some point it was time I took my turn chairing a resettlement effort. The political debates in 2016 prompted great interest in the possibility, and with the council's permission, we recruited volunteers. Quickly, we had a task force of 30-some members, most all young couples and families. We worked on preparations and made application to LIRS. But by this time, no families were available for adoption, the new administration having changed course. With all that we'd gathered, we furnished an apartment for LIRS in the DC suburbs for a family who'd come from Afghanistan, and we explored other possibilities. We learned of a cluster of Syrian refugee families who'd come in 2016 to the western side of Baltimore, not far from Catonsville. There's a movie on Amazon Prime about 4 of those families. It's titled This Is Home, and it won 3 of 7 possible nominations, and I recommend it to you. We began work with the Al-Fahad, one of those families, since in November 2017. They've since made much progress and have now been financially independent for well over a year. And until the pandemic, we were still providing tutoring a couple days a week. Now we're sometimes asked for advice and are still connected as friends. It's the second generation which is finally and most fully assimilated. Among the Vietnamese and the Kosovar and Sudanese children, now adults, there is a doctor, a physical therapist, mechanical engineer, a shock trauma nurse, and the oldest of the Sudanese girl, now on the carrier Abraham Lincoln, is a sailor in the United States Navy, which just recently returned from a mission to the Persian Gulf. Here's the pattern, very successful, which we've used each time. I can't, even though our focus is on the legacy, I can't close without encouraging you and inviting you to make this ministry a legacy of your own life, the life of the congregation where you're a member or where you serve as a pastor. Our members would say that these sponsorships have been among the most memorable parish highlights across the years for everyone. And they become life-changing experiences for those who are most closely involved. What we would do is we'd secure several capable, committed persons to provide leadership, and always different persons from the sponsorship previous. We'd ask council for permission to solicit the congregation for volunteers, for household goods and furnishings, and for funds. It was the task force that would sign the application papers with LIRS. We were clear that we never used congregational funds. And actually, we always had widespread and enthusiastic support. There are rich benefits for engaging in this ministry of welcome. We care for refugees who've come to the United States through the work of Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service. And we care for those who are still overseas in refugee camps by our assistance with Lutheran World Relief. First and foremost, it's a positive and public witness to the invitation and command to see our Lord in the face of the stranger and bid welcome. Number two, it's faithful to our legacy as a beacon of freedom, what Luther called the last best hope of earth. Lest be gone the glow from that beaconed hand of the mighty Lady Liberty in New York Harbor. Third, if Hebrew law commanded God's people, now quoting Deuteronomy, to love the stranger, reminding them how a millennia before they themselves had been strangers in the land of Egypt, ought we not, as a nation of immigrants, remember our own history, strangers in this land just a couple decades or centuries ago, and bid welcome to those strangers who now seek a haven here? It will illumine a far wider horizon for the congregation's view and connect your congregation in a lively and loving way to world events. Number five, and more specifically, the children of the congregation are given refugee friends. More than a generation of children at Salem have now made good friends with refugees. I cherish this photo of my son, Micah, and Tan Wang, who attended preschool together. She just a couple months after arrival, when she still spoke no English. And here they are with their diplomas. Now his sons, my grandsons, Abram and Benjamin, attend an excellent magnet school for middle and high school in St. Paul. And they list this as their demographics: 12% Hispanic and Latin, 25% Black and African American, 54% Asian, almost all Hmong, and 5% white. Photos of the boys' birthday parties mirror those demographics, and they see the world through different and clearer eyes than ever I did at that age. By God's grace and with courage and determination, we can see the world that way too. The need has never been greater. Though traditional sponsorship is extremely limited right now, we can advocate for a change of policy. The LRS gives multiple ways that we could all be involved. Solberg's book notes that in the years between the passage of the Refugee Act of 1980 and the book's writing in 1992, in that span of 12 years, the U.S. accepted over 3 million refugees and asylees. This year, we will receive no more than 18,000. Solberg closes his book appealing for involvement and notes that there were then 16 million refugees and displaced persons in the world. Now, the United Nations states that there is a record number of 80 million refugees and displaced persons in the world, more than the number at the end of the Second World War. Every one of them a beloved child of God. God bids you come and be a part of this legacy of welcome.
Thank you so very much, Pastor Whetstone, for that wonderful history And it's so rich and full and heartbreaking all at the same time because of where we've been and the things that we've been doing as Lutherans and where we are today as part of our nation and the policies that are being laid out as part of our nation. It's hard stuff to hear about 2,100 people in 1 year being resettled just by Lutherans is a phenomenal. Lutheran congregations in the area is just a phenomenal number. I'm going to open the question and answer space. So we have with us Kristen Whitty, who is the Director for Outreach for Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Services. We also have with us Reverend Ed Whetstone, who is happy to answer questions. I'm going to highlight their videos here so that you can all see their faces as well as mine, because they're wonderful faces. So please feel free to put questions and comments and thoughts in the Q&A section. And so we already have one. How do we sustain each other during the frustrating, emotionally exhausting time of this xenophobic administration? How do we sustain each other during this?
To begin, thank you for having me. I think sustaining always is grounded in prayer. And if we return ourselves to the true messages that Jesus Christ presented us in the Gospels, it is abundantly transparent that, as Pastor Ed said, we are recognizing the beauty of God present with our brothers and sisters, that we are one. But then one of the challenges is to not engage everything. So often, be it a social media meme or a passing comment by someone, there is a time and a place for conversion of heart. And that often happens in relationship and through experience. So as we provide opportunities for refugee families, for stories like the one you shared of your son in preschool, I think those stories are what transform people's hearts. They stop thinking of migration as an issue and start recognizing that it's the human person. It's a story. It's a family. It's a child. And when we break down those divides, we actually are moving closer and closer to the gospel. So from my vantage point, we bear witness by our relationships, by our respect, by our love, by our testimony about the value of migrants and refugees in the United States. And by doing that, we serve as disciples. So I begin everything with a relationship with Jesus Christ, but then I also think we have to model those relationships and model our commitment to the relationships that we have with people that may or may not agree with us. Pastor Ed?
I don't know that I have anything wise to add to that. Surely all of you have said is true. I guess one of my great hopes is that having given opportunity for personal relationships, these things we've had a part of the parish experience at Salem, the issues become personal. And even if they have not been involved in the sponsorship in a key way,
it has a face for them, has faces. That's hard, how you translate that to the wider community. I don't know. It's hard. I mean, the question, it seems a topic of conversation in those several groups, which I find myself by Zoom or occasionally in person, and the conversation is much characterized by a weariness, discouragement, but hopeful too. I mean, we can't lose hope. And talking about these periods of great migration before, the world's people have been in dark places, and are so trusting that somehow God will show us a path here too, not as in the crisis of being a refugee, but the crisis of being in a time of isolation and fear and restriction and resentment and hostility, and trying to find a way to live through that.
Thank you. Thank you both. Another question. This one. I have recently seen an article that suggests white Christians in America are now even less likely than ever to engage with issues surrounding racism. How do we simultaneously engage with racism amongst Americans and also with xenophobic racism? Right.
You have a crowd of other people to help answer this, right? Oh.
Yeah, that's a question. Pastor Ed, did you want to speak, and then I'll follow up on you this time?
I'll be glad
I'd be
to
happy
follow.
to go with it if you want me to. We're looking at a cultural change in Moray around privilege and entitlement, and that is going to cause upheaval. Because to dismantle the entire structure that has created a world of white Christian male heterosexual privilege, to dismantle that requires the giving of power. It requires a shift in power, and it requires a shift in resource. That is threatening for many, many people. And it requires an entire cultural change. That doesn't happen in an instant, and it doesn't happen when just one march happens. But by shining the light on the sin of racism, by shining the light on the evil of racism and how it is systematically permeated American culture since its founding, we're able to actually name the problem. And by naming the problem, similar to the 12-step programs, the first step is naming that there's a problem. And I believe that culturally, we are at a place where particularly those who have been suffering and who are in pain are naming the problem, and those who have been sitting by or have been in neutral or haven't realized how much it's affecting others are beginning to mobilize. That is why it is so important for all of us to engage in any way possible, engage our voices, engage our families, engage our communities, because there is no neutral anymore. There never really was a neutral. By being neutral, you were supporting the structure that was oppressing people. Now we are moving into proactivity. And by moving into that proactivity, that's going to threaten people who are currently sitting with power, people who haven't had to think about it. One of my favorite images for entitlement is that when people in power look at themselves in a mirror, they see just themselves. But when people who are oppressed because of a characteristic within society, because of one of their characteristics, they see themselves as, I see myself as Kristen, woman. Other people might see themselves as Erica, biracial woman, Muslim. And they have to every day manage the fact that the world sees stereotypes and experiences based around those ways of naming someone. Whereas the privilege of not having to think about that, not having to think about your identity, because your identity is an identity of power, is actually a privilege in itself. We have the opportunity to make significant shifts in how we view, and I'm going to use this word very carefully, other, because there is no other. There is only us. And we have for generations and generations defined other so that we can hold power. And it's time to make that shift. It's the shift that Christ calls us to. It's the shift that church calls us to. It's the shift that makes us actually the kingdom here on earth.
I recall one of the conversations in seminary about, I was in seminary during the 68 election and the war in Vietnam and all that, and there was great concern that what does it mean to say that the kingdom is coming? Thy kingdom come, as God, and to believe that God promises that it does. And the professor says, oh, it comes. It is always coming. Sometimes the advance is by 51%, but it comes. Our congregation has a group gathering on Zoom to discuss racism, the work of anti-racism. And this, is sort of the perennial topic. We talk about various books and concerns and such, but we sort of come around to how can we keep going? What can we hope for? And looking back and sort of saying, we thought people thought there was progress, in the civil rights movement, and look what we've still got to contend with, and yet each time things are better, and they do seem to set off alarms for the fears that, as you've mentioned them, but there is progress each time, and it arouses a reaction and opposition in people, and it's just what we likely need to expect every so often. So many of us hope this may become a point that we have opportunity to turn things around, but it may take longer. It may take longer.
Thank you, Pastor Whetstone. Basel, welcome. So glad that you could join us. I appreciate you taking the time to be with us today. Will you take just a moment to introduce yourselves to our participants? We're in a question and answer period right now, and so I have two questions then once you've introduced yourself, and you might be thrown in the deep end right away.
Well, thank you so much. First for the invitation, and second for this gathering and to talk about these issues. Can you hear me well?
You're very faint.
All right. I'll try to raise up my voice, and at any point, if you can't hear me, just let me know. I'll put my headphones.
And are we to address you as Bassel or Mr. Wonderful?
I didn't think.
I'll choose Bassel because I don't know if I deserve to be doing this. But anyways, thank you so much. Actually, we bought this for my son because he has a desk right next to me, learning, going to school. So kind of like to make his space friendly, but he chose to give it back to me anyways. So thank you so much, everyone. I was saying that my name is Bassel. I'm a program manager for migrant services at Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service. What I do at LIRS is I design and implement programs that impact the lives of asylum seekers and protection seekers here in the US, particularly on the border side, the southern border with Mexico, and basically wherever a detention center exists, we try to have services to folks detained and post-detention as soon as they are released out. This is to put it in short. I would love to take questions, and I hope to be able to answer them all. And again, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much. Our next one is, I would like to believe that, well, first, before I do the question, I want to say to Kristen, thank you for the reminder. And I'm actually going to make this into a poster and put it on my wall as a reminder that there is no other. There is just us. And you know, that's our biblical mandate, is that there are no more outies, that everyone is an innie. And yeah, thank you. I don't need to go deeper into that. Thank you. So Scott asks, I would like to believe that people can be moved by sharing these stories, and I remain hopeful. But how do you move people that can look at babies in cages and say their family shouldn't have come in the first place? It's a good one, Scott.
I would assume that this is directed to me, right?
It's open to the panel. You're part of the open panel.
Awesome. Well,
So
if you allow
jump
me
in.
then, since I have the floor. You're absolutely right, spot on. I mean, these pictures that we've seen and we continue to see, if this doesn't move people, what does? I think I think that what's missing is there are a couple of reasons. First, we need to look at the reasons that led these people to leave and choose to migrate at the first place, and the situations that pushed them out of their homes. And no one wants to leave. It's never a choice. Like, I'm living with my families, in my land, with friends, in the community where I grew up, and then out of the sudden, I just try to pack up and try to kind of like leave my loved ones and leave everything behind and choose to go in this journey where the risk is enormous, and people lose their lives just so they can get to the safety. And then once people get to the U.S., they're faced with these, you know, the policies that are coming right and left at them. So that's kind of like, first we need to shed the light on the reasons that pushed people to leave their country of origin. And then second, I really want to encourage folks who really see everything going on and doesn't take actions. If they ever volunteered and saw things firsthand. I mean, we always hear right now, we continue at all times to hear about, oh, this is fake news. This is well, experience it yourself and then get the lessons learned to yourself. So I'll talk about my personal experiences. Whenever I used to be a caseworker and have direct interactions with families, it is a life-changing experience to see that when these folks are here in our country and looking at the local community and seeing like it's actually a very fulfilling experience to myself, and I'm actually whenever I volunteer to help others, I'm actually helping myself to be a better person. That's kind of how I put it, and I think when folks see everything that's going on, let's encourage them to take action. Let's take their hands and say, all right, let's go to the community center, and of course in respect to all the COVID-19 and the CDC guidelines, but in general, there's a lot of things that can be done, and once people experience this God's work, I think that will definitely gonna impact their lives and hopefully change the narrative.
Absolutely. So glad Michelle's here. I would like to point out, though, that we have a crisis of apathy that has been going on here in the United States for a little bit. We have a crisis of not seeing ourselves in the stories, in the experiences of others. We have not been respecting the dignity of the human person in the way that we are called to. And that has become something that's been passed on from generation to generation. It's the opposite of the gospel. And so my recommendation is, oddly, brace yourself for Christian counterculturalism, but my recommendation would be to treat that person with a great deal of respect and compassion when they disagree with you and when they're saying these people shouldn't have even come here, because they're not acting out of experience. They're not acting out of a desperate desire to be ignorant. They're acting out of what they know. And by compassionately and gently engaging in conversation, which I believe the third session of this 3-session is focusing on this exact question. How do we engage in those dialogues well? I believe that that is where people start to understand that maybe their belief that they came at because they saw one article in one television show once, that it might not be with context. And we can only share that with people when they are hearing that we actually care about them, when we're living that empathetic, countercultural message that's present in the gospel. So while it would be lovely and pleasant to have a screeching match sometimes with people who disagree with us, I have learned that that's just going down the rabbit hole, and I'm not modeling anything different than what they're doing. So much of my experience is to say, I'm sorry to hear that you believe that. That's not my experience. Can you tell me what's going on that you believe that just because they came across the border, children should be away from their moms? Oh, no, I don't believe that. Well, hold on. Now, let's sit down and talk about this, because this is something that I really feel passionately about. Judgment is something that it's quick to jump to, but it's never going to build a relationship. So my suggestion would be to model the kind of openness that we hope that they will come to. And that's not always easy. It's much easier to be closed-minded, to be perfectly honest. It's much easier to shut your mind and your heart from that which is asking it to be cracked and to be vulnerable. But the truth is that's what we are called to do. So I would just bring an empathetic spirit, recognizing that the person that we're dealing with is also a human who has dignity and needs to be respected and loved, no matter how challenging that might be.
Thank you for those answers. Pastor Whetstone, did you want to weigh in?
I guess just one thing that occurred to me is that, so of course, so many of the people with whom we might have such a conversation are Christian. And this isn't to say that, I mean, so many of my liberal friends are not conventionally Christian. So I obviously not being a Christian doesn't mean you're more closed to these things than open. What I really mean is, because we are Christian, we have both suggested we begin somehow at the same place, and to say, who is Jesus to you? I mean, and what values drive the emotions that you're feeling, and what you feel would be important to happen here, or how you would want to influence our nation. What values are driving the positions you're taking and the things you're feeling, and maybe there's a way to have a conversation without naming bills before the Congress or personalities up for election. It's hard, but I think it's probably possible. Yeah.
Thank you. Emily asks, in what ways has Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Services and/or congregations partnered with ecumenical and/or more secular immigration organizations?
Well, I can also speak to that from experience. First of all, advancing our mission, which is helping the refugees, protection seekers, cannot happen without these very valuable, important partnerships. It's like, we always have like one hand cannot clap when there's always those two hands that need to come together. So these partnerships, we've always sought these partnerships, and they're always vital to eventually the clients that we're trying to serve here. So we had a lot of opportunities that we worked together with faith-based, non-faith-based organizations. I'll speak about when we all heard, I think about less than a year ago, when the border, when there was many families are being released out of immigration detention or at the border. So we at LIRS, we started what we called the Respite and Welcome program, which is basically to provide housing to these families that are released in El Paso or in Phoenix in Arizona, and they move on after they are released out from immigration detention. They need to spend one night, book their ticket, and move on to their final destination, which could be anywhere in the United States. So we immediately turned to the community to be able to serve these folks, and we've noticed that many faith-based organizations from all denominations came together, and they actually proactively trying hard to serve these immigrants. And many of the faith-based organizations that we work with have opened up their places of worship to provide housing to these families for a night or 2 nights until they move on to their final destination. Similarly, we've also had a lot of partnerships with what we're calling as secular organizations. We basically opened our arms to anyone who's willing to participate in these efforts, and you would be surprised how many people, how many organizations are really want to do good, and they're waiting for that opportunity to plug in and be of support. So in our Respite and Welcome program, which was targeted to provide hospitality at the border, in the partnership, we've had many congregations were in charge of providing hot meals, and that was all that they do. They did not provide the housing; they didn't have the capacity to it, but they still wanted to be able to serve, and that was kind of like their main thing, that they did cook for all of these different shelters that were available in the community. Another group were in charge of backpack supplies. All that they do is getting those backpacks, they put in them fruits, water, anything that's kind of like keep people hydrated during their journey on a 48-hour bus trip. So that was all that they do. And there are still those faith-based that I mentioned that were able to kind of like have a space to provide the housing, and they relied on volunteers and community members to come together and be able to help folks book their travel or find resources as they need to, whether it's like an over-the-counter medical supply or sometimes just a phone call to a friend or a family member. This is just one example of our partnership, and we definitely, even if we had all the funding in the world, like it's really not something that can be happen just by throwing money at it, right? Like it needs to have this community that will come together and be able to lift up and kind of like overcome the challenges and show people that there are a lot of folks here in the U.S. that love you, that welcome you, that are happy to have you in the communities. And that's something that, there's all the money in the world cannot be an alternative. Those emotional feelings as well are highly important. Yeah, I could go on and on. There are a lot of other examples where we have actually, we've actually had a lot of groups come together, and that's also prior to COVID-19, and they were providing visitation to people in immigration detention. And that's also something that were really, really very important to the detainees, because they were detained not for a crime they did, just because they asked asylum here in the United States. So there are lots of groups that came and said, well, we'll visit you in detention. And basically, like I've seen folks take off from their work and drive sometimes up to an hour to go to this remote location where the immigration detention center existed, and offer to sit down and talk to a stranger who is detained, and basically just to offer a social connection, which is the only window to freedom for these folks in immigration detention. So that's also another form where I think the faith-based and the secular organizations have been really supportive and helpful.
Thank you, Basel. Kristen, I'm going to put you on the spot and just, right, you can yell at me later. I'm going to put you on the spot and ask you to dig a little deeper into a part of our conversation from the other day in regards to outreach and congregational engagement. You were speaking specifically about that our congregations are our volunteer force. And so are you recalling that?
Yes, I do.
Yeah, so can you talk a bit about that?
Sure. I think one of the most amazing things about how God works is that you never see how the strings are tying until they tie. And everything that Pastor Whetstone said in regards to Lutheran legacy leading up to this moment is now being lived out by the work that Basel and I are doing. We are the next chapter in a very long book. One of the most incredible things that I have had the honor of watching is the fact that for so many congregations, their work how they live their mission is actually being lived out, not just in service to the insular, but actually in service to the global mission of the church. And that is just beautiful. They understand that it's not us serving us alone, but it's the fact that we're called, go therefore and make of all disciples. We're supposed to be sharing love in every interaction, in every corner of the world. And we may not be able to travel to every corner of the world, but can we share that love? And so one of the things that I am very excited about is, I'll give you an example. The outreach team just launched a program called Gather. And Gather is spotlighting, in the fall, Gather is spotlighting Afghanistan and is talking about people who, they're called SIVs, special immigrant visas, where they worked with the United States overseas, most often, and then received a special visa because, for all intents and purposes, their lives are now in jeopardy because they helped. And they are being moved here into the United States. And it spotlights a family, the Abdullah family, who went through a program, a youth refugee pathways program for careers that LIRS created and works through. But it spotlights the family and it spotlights the culture and it gives recipes and talks about, and in a time of Corona, we have the opportunity to sit together with our children, with our parents, with the pod that we are allowed to sit with when we have dinner. And we're allowed to share what it is to be someone who is not walking the same journey we're walking, but yet has a beautiful journey to share and a story that they can bring to us. So the more we can raise that awareness and have those kind of cultural experiences, as congregations, someday when we are all gathering again together, as congregations, we will then also raise the importance of global mission. So I love my pet project at LIRS is that I fell in love with when I was even interviewing for the position, is a program called Hope for the Holidays. And Hope for the Holidays is a program where congregations, families, and what we're finding, back to the secular and non-Lutheran world, what we're finding is a lot of young adult groups who just want to help. They don't see themselves as faith-based or affiliated, but they want to do something. So what they do is they write Christmas cards to people in detention and people on the other side of the border being held. And we give money so that children can have journals and pens and they can have Christmas presents. And families, whether they're in foster care, whether they're in detention, whether they're somewhere in the process, so that we can be that hope in dark times, particularly for children. So when we're looking at ways that congregations can be, even in this difficult time in both our country and with a pandemic, people can still act. They can still move mountains. We received a gorgeous poem. Bissell and I both heard it at the same meeting, a poem written by someone who received the Christmas cards and just wanted to thank us for acknowledging that they had value, that they were alive, that they still existed, and that they were precious to God. Think about that for a second. We have the power by just sending a card, by mobilizing a group of friends to all send cards. We can actually make it so people are truly feeling Christ, wrapping his love around them, no matter what their faith is. And by giving, we also then connect to that mission of Christ, whether the person is there for that reason or not. We can bring those young adults that feel very disconnected from church, but feel very connected with the need to stop some of the inhumane treatment of others. We can bring them in to a better understanding of the love of God by showing them how to love another.
Thank you both for that. I'm gonna bring the last question. And so our current administration has, of course, set all kinds of policies about welcoming immigrants and refugees. LIRS has felt the effects of those policies in having to do sweeping downsizing over the last years. And we are on the cusp of an election. We are less than 50 days from an election. Depending on the results of the election, what is LIRS planning?
This is not an easy one, I'll tell you that.
Right.
Yeah.
Marcel, do you want to take this one first?
Yeah, let me take the first step.
Okay.
So we actually had started the scenario planning, I think even a couple months ago. I mean, it's something that, of course, the past 4 years has been, there has been a lot of different policies that LIS has to pivot and, try to stick as strong as possible to our mission and make sure that we're continuing to serve the people, even with the very limited resources, even with the different policies that are affecting our clients on their day-to-day lives, even with the public health pandemic, which was not anticipated, not planned, but still has led to a lot of families losing their jobs and becoming at risk of homelessness. So all of this had, of course, its impact financially on the organization. But I mean, I'll tell you what, me personally, 3 years ago, I never thought that we will approach the end of the term, the 4 years, and we still have our jobs. I mean, we're still doing, working and making sure that our clients are being taken care of. Of course, we've lost colleagues. Of course, we've had to cut down on spendings, on all of that kind of things. But what we didn't lose is the spirit that we will, no matter what, continue to do our part and make sure that our clients are being taken care of. And even if that has led to, increased workloads and all of those kind of crazy hours that we put to work and so on. Now for the next year, it is, of course, there are lots of question marks and a lot of questions about the election, about even the COVID, the public health, all of those different things. And I mean, for me, I'm glad that it's above my pay grade to make those decisions. But we actually, I mean, having that, the organization started this scenario planning, I'm confident that with the staff we have, with the supporters that LRS count on, with the communities where we serve, I'm kind of almost positive and very confident that no matter what the next 4 years are going to be, I'm pretty sure that we will still exist. I'm pretty sure that our clients will still be taken care of. I'm not sure if that kind of like, I don't have the actual document where we have the scenarios and the answers, because it is changing. Every day is different, so it's a living document. So, but one thing that that's not changing is our commitment to the clients that we serve.
This has been a painful time. Thank you so much, Marcel. You said it so well. The resources and the pipeline for bringing people into the United States, so much has been throttled. We are experiencing a great deal of of suffering, and we're watching people suffer. And every meeting that I've been in recently has an A scenario and a B scenario, because they are so dramatically different in regards to refugee resettlement and unaccompanied minors, family reunification, detention. We would be dealing with two completely different worlds, but I cannot thank you enough, Marcel. The bottom line is we're going to be there, and we might be smaller and we might be a little bit worse for wear, and we may have had to make very painful decisions, but we'll be standing with the most vulnerable, and we will not abandon our mission. And because of that, Christ never said it was going to be easy to be a disciple. As a matter of fact, we were told it was going to be hard. We were told it was going to be difficult, and we were going to suffer, and we were going to struggle. But there is a glory in serving our Lord. And there is also the belief, the true belief, that we are called to stand with the most vulnerable, and we are not abdicating where we stand. And because of that, we live that legacy. There may not be as many of us, but the power of the congregations, the power of the rostered ministers, the power of the bishops, the power of the district presidents, the power of all of these people who stand behind us and say, there may only be 2 or 3 of you, but we've got your back and we will stand with you. That is inspiring. We are never standing alone. LIRS in this very difficult time has never been standing alone. It might have hurt. We sometimes might be barely getting up off our knees. But let me tell you, we are so blessed. We have people who are coming out of the woodwork, donors who are showing up and saying, listen, this is what I have to offer you, but I know that there are people who are suffering worse than I am. That changes things. It means that we can stand for 1 day more or 2 days more. So as someone who I know, there are so many people on this call who are those people, who are the people who have been standing with us when the messages come out that we're not welcoming people anymore here in the US, or we don't want them here, who are standing there saying there is no them, there is only us, and we will stand. That's who we are, and that's who we're going to continue to be. And I am so deeply grateful that this question was asked, because it has been hard. But it is, and it's not guaranteed to get any easier, but we're not going to go anywhere. Just like Basel said, it's a dedication and a calling and a mission.
Thank you for your honesty in that, and for letting me ask that question, because yes, it was important for people to be able to hear and to know what we as supporters can be doing, and that you're looking at all the scenarios. That's helpful for us to be able to articulate out there as well. I have one more question, but I want to honor people's time and pay attention to that. And so I will say join us next week, where we're going to be talking about how do you enter into these hard conversations. And so we'll have a person who's going to walk us through the process of entering into these hard conversations. And then we'll have some opportunity for breakouts next week, to look at 3 different areas of focus that you might be interested in. So please be sure to join us next Thursday at the same link at the same time, 11:45, and we'll dig deeper into now what do we do? We've laid some really solid foundations, and now we're going to see how do we do this stuff? What are we going to do about it? And so join us next week for those. And so the final question is, personal contact so important. Cards, calls, FaceTime type connections. How can we make these connections with those who are not IT savvy? And so I think one of the ways was doing the Christmas card thing. We can certainly drop off a box of Christmas cards to people and say, can you please write out Christmas cards, and then go pick them up. writing letters, paying attention to news, any of those kinds of things. Do you have other ideas about what might be ways for those who are not IT savvy? So some quick, popcorn suggestions.
I think Pastor Ed said it beautifully when earlier he was talking about those moments of relationship. And I think when you're grocery shopping and you're wearing a mask and nobody can see that you're smiling at them, I think those moments of interaction, when you see a family who's taking a walk just to say hello and greet them, and maybe they're wearing a hijab, and maybe they're you've never seen them before, and maybe they're new to the neighborhood, or maybe they've been in the neighborhood for a long time, but we haven't been in our homes this much. This is a great opportunity to take that one step to, hi, you're welcome here. Acknowledging someone's presence, acknowledging their personal dignity. But I also have heard recently that a number of congregations are having very intentional prayer time, asking people to pray in their homes for very specific issues. Praying for congregants who have cancer, praying for people who are in the hospital and alone, praying for people who are in detention, praying for people who are trying to get across the border for their safety and the safety of their children, and asking them to be prayer partners for very specific communities that are suffering at this time. Prayers for those who are alone and lonely, with the hope that when we are all able to leave our homes in safety, they will then use that as a catalyst for a ministry to that specific population. What could we do when we are no longer unable to visit, when we can go into someone's home and say, hello, would you like breakfast? Would you like to share a donut? Those moments of intimacy, we'll get back many of them again. But when it comes to ways of helping, writing letters, donating money, being a part of a prayer community, asking your congregation what the history of working with LARS is, and maybe expanding upon that history, learning about what has been done in your congregation, and seeing if anybody is interested in continuing that kind of work. We have 80 years of experience with people and with congregations throughout the United States. People really want to help. And maybe this is a great opportunity for discernment about whether you're called to leadership in regards to this. I dare say Pastor Ed's witness is very similar to many others. I found in my heart that this is something I was called to, and people just followed because God was calling me to this incredible ministry of justice and to welcome. And people just show up. And I really believe that right now is a great time when the kind of the clutch is put into our culture to really discern if God is calling you to invest time, talent, and treasure into work with migrants and refugees, because the need will never, has always been great, but with the large global migration, it's not going to lessen. And more people desperately need you to serve.
Thank you so very much, everyone. Okay. Thank you so very much. Great content. Looking forward to next week is what a participant said. Thank you all for participating. Thank you to our panelists for being here today and giving us an opportunity to hear from your expertise and your experiences. Kristen will be with us next week as well. And so I look forward to having her with us again. Please be in touch with any of these folks at LRS if you have more questions or want to know ways that you can be engaged. Until we're together again, blessings everybody, and goodwill to all of you. Be safe and be healthy and be well. And I hope to see you again next week. Thank you so much. Take care all.